Chapter 18. The Joad family moved slowly westward, up into the mountains of New Mexico, past the pinnacles and pyramids of the upland. They climbed into the high country of Arizona, and through a gap they looked down onto the painted desert. A border guard stopped them. "Where are you going?" "To California." "How long you plan to be in Arizona?" "No longer than we can get across here." "Got any plants?" "No plants." "I ought to look your stuff over." "I tell you, we ain't got no plants." The guard put a little sticker on the windshield. "Okay, go ahead, but you better keep moving." "Sure, we aim to." They crawled up the slopes, and the low, twisted trees covered the slopes. Holbrook, Joseph City, Winslow. And then the tall trees began, and the cars spouted steam and labored up the slopes. And there was Flagstaff, and that was the top of it all. Down from Flagstaff over the great plateaus, and the road disappeared in the distance ahead. The water was scarce. Water was to be bought, 5 cents, 10 cents, 15 cents a gallon. The sun drained the dry, rocky country, and ahead were jagged, broken peaks, the western wall of Arizona. And now they were in flight from the sun and the drought. They drove all night and came to the mountains in the night, and they crawled the jagged ramparts in the night, and their dim lights flickered on the pale stone walls of the road. They passed the summit in the dark and came slowly down in the late night through the shattered stone debris of Oatman, and when the daylight came they saw the Colorado River below them. They drove to Topak, pulled up at the bridge while a guard washed off the windshield sticker. Then across the bridge and into the broken rock wilderness. And although they were dead and weary and the morning heat was growing, they stopped. Pa called, "We're there. We're in California." They looked dully at the broken rock glaring under the sun, and across the river, the terrible ramparts of Arizona. "We got the desert," said Tom. We got to get to the water and rest." The road runs parallel to the river, and it was well into the morning when the burning motors came to Needles, where the river runs swiftly among the reeds. The Joads and Wilsons drove to the river, and they sat in the cars, looking at the lovely water flowing by and the green reeds jerking slowly in the current. There was a little encampment by the river, 11 tents near the water, and the swamp grass on the ground. Tom leaned out the truck window. "Mind if we stop here a piece?" A stout woman scrubbing clothes in a bucket looked up. "We don't own it, mister. Stop if you want. There'll be a cop down to look you over." And she went back to her scrubbing in the sun. The two cars pulled to a clear place on the swamp grass. The tents were passed down, and the Wilson tent set up, and the Joad tarpaulin stretched over its rope. Winfield and Ruthie walked slowly down through the willows to the reedy place. Ruthie said with a soft vehemence, "California. This here's California, and we're right in it." Winfield broke a tool and twisted it free, and he put the white pulp in his mouth and chewed it. They walked into the river, stood quietly, the water about the calves of their legs. "We got the desert yet," Ruthie said. "What's the desert like?" "I don't know. I've seen pictures once says a desert. They was bones every place." Man bones? Some, I guess, but mostly cow bones. "We gonna get to see them bones?" "Maybe. I don't know. Gonna go across here at night. That's what Tom says. Tom says we get the living Jesus burned out of us if we go in the daylight." "It feels nice and cool," said Winfield, and he squidged his toes in the sand of the bottom. They heard Ma calling, "Ruthie, Winfield, you come back." They turned and walked slowly back through the reeds and the willows. The other tents were quiet. For a moment, when the cars came up, a few heads had stuck out between the flaps and then were withdrawn. Now the family tents were up, and the men gathered together. Tom said, "I'm going to go down and take a bath. That's what I'm going to do before I sleep." "How's Grandma since we got her in the tent?" "Dunno," said Pa. "Couldn't seem to wake her up." He cocked his head toward the tent. A whining, babbling voice came from under the canvas. Ma went quickly inside. She woke up all right," said Noah. "Seems like all night she was a croaking up on the truck. She's all out of sense. Tom said, "Hell, she was wore out. If she don't get some rest pretty soon, she ain't gonna last. She's just wore out. Anybody come with me? I'm gonna wash, and I'm gonna sleep in the shade all day long." He moved away, and the other men followed him. They took off their clothes in the willows, and then they walked into the river and sat down. For a long time they sat, holding themselves with heels dug in the sand, and only their heads stuck out of the river. "Jesus, I needed this," Al said. He took a handful of sand from the bottom and scrubbed himself with it. They lay in the water and looked across at the sharp peaks called the Needles, and at the White Rock Mountains of Arizona. "We come through them," Pa said in wonder. Uncle John ducked his head under water. "Well, we're here. This here is California, and she don't look so prosperous." "Got the desert yet," said Tom. "And I hear she's a son of a bitch." "No, lass. Gonna try her tonight? What you think, Pa?" Tom asked. "Well, I don't know. Do us good to get a little rest, especially Grandma. But other ways, I kind of like to get her across her and get settled into a job. Only got about $40 left. I'll feel better when we're all working and a little money coming in." Each man sat in the water and felt the tug of the current. The preacher let his arms and hands float off on the surface. The bodies were white to the necks and the wrists, and burned dark brown on the hands and faces, with V's of brown at the collarbones. They scratched themselves with sand, and Noah said lazily, "I'd like to just stay here, like to lay here forever, never get hungry and never get sad, lay in the water all life long, lazy as a brood sow in the mud." And Tom, looking at the ragged peaks across the river and the Needles downstream, "Never seen such tough mountains. This here's a murder country, and this here is the bones of country. Wonder if we'll ever get in a place where folks can live without fighting hard scrabble and rocks. I seen pictures of a country flat and green, and with little houses like Ma says, white. Ma got her heart set on a white house. Get to thinking they ain't no such country. I seen pictures like that." Pa said, "Wait till we get to California. You'll see a nice country then." "Jesus Christ, Pa, this here is California." Two men dressed in jeans and sweaty blue shirts came through the willows and looked towards the naked men. They said, "How's swimming?" "Dunno," said Tom. "We ain't tried none. Sure feels good just to sit here, though. Mind if we come in and sit? She ain't our river. We'll lend you a little piece of her." The men shucked off their pants, peeled their shirts, and waded out. The dust coated their legs to the knee. Their feet were pale and soft with sweat. They settled lazily into the water and washed listlessly at their flanks. Sunbitten they were, a father and a boy. They grunted and groaned in the water. Pa asked politely, "Going west?" "No, we come from there. Going back home. We can't make no living out there." "Where's home?" Tom asked. "Panhandle. Come from near Pampa." Pa asked, "Can you make a living there?" "No, but at least we can starve to death with folks we know. Won't have a bunch of fellas that hates us starved with." Pa said, "You're the second fella to talk like that. What makes them hate you?" "Dunno," said the man. He cupped his hands full of water and rubbed his face, snorting and bubbling. Dusty water ran out of his hair and streaked his neck. "I'd like to hear some more about this." "Me too," Tom added. "Why these folks out west hate you?" The man looked sharply at Tom. "You just going west?" "Just on our way." "You ain't never been to California?" "No, we ain't." "Well, don't take my word. Go see for yourself." "Yeah, but a fella kind of likes to know what he's getting into." "Well, if you truly want to know, I'm a fella that asks questions and give her some thought. She's a nice country, but she was stole a long time ago. You get across the desert and come into the country around Bakersfield, and you ain't never seen such pretty country. All orchards and grapes, prettiest country you ever seen. And you pass land flat and fine, with water 30 feet down, and land that's laying fallow. But you can't have none of that land. That's land in cattle company. And if they don't want you to work her, she ain't gonna get worked. You go in there and plant you a little corn, and you'll go to jail." "Good land, you say, and they ain't working her?" "Yes, sir, good land, and they ain't." "Well, sir, that'll get you a little mad, but you ain't seen nothing. People are gonna have a look in their eye. They're gonna look at you, and their face says, 'I don't like you, you son of a bitch.' You're gonna be deputy sheriffs, and they'll pushing you around. You camp on the roadside and they'll move you on. You're gonna see in people's faces how they hate you. And I tell you something, they're gonna hate you because they're scared. They know a hungry fella gonna get food even if you got to take it. They know that if a fellow's land a sin and somebody's gonna take it. What the hell? You never been called Okie yet? Tom said, Okie, what's that? Well, Okie used to mean you was from Oklahoma. Now it means that you're a dirty son of a bitch. Okie means you're scum. Don't mean nothing itself. It's the way they say it. But I can't tell you nothing. You got to go there. I hear it's 300,000 of our people there and living like hogs, 'cause everything in California is owned. They ain't nothing left, and them people that owns it is gonna hang on to it if they got to kill everybody in the world to do it, and they're scared, and that makes them mad. You got to see it. You got to hear it. Prettiest goddamn country you ever seen, but they ain't nice to you, them folks. They're scared, so scared and worried they ain't even nice to each other. Tom looked down into the water, and he dug his heel in the sand. Suppose the fella got work and saved a little. Couldn't he get a little land? The older man laughed, and then he looked at his boy, and his silent boy grinned almost in triumph. And the man said, "You ain't gonna get no steady work. Gonna scrabble for your dinner every day, and you're gonna do her with people looking mean at you. Pick cotton, and you're gonna be sure the scales ain't honest. Some of them is, and some of them ain't. But you gotta think all the scales crooked, and you don't know which ones. Ain't nothing you can do about her anyway." Paused slowly. Ain't it nice out there at all? Sure, nice to look at, but you can't have none of it. There's a grove of yellow oranges, and a guy with a gun that's got the right to kill you if you touch one. There's a newspaper fella near the coast, got 1,000,000 acres. Casey looked up quickly. 1,000,000 acres? What in the world can you do with 1,000,000 acres? I don't know, he just got it. Runs a few cattle, got guards every place to keep folks out, rides around in a bulletproof car. I seen pictures of him, fat, soft fella with a little mean eyes, and a mouth like an asshole. Scared he's gonna die. Got 1,000,000 acres and scared of dying. Casey demanded, "What in the hell can he do with 1,000,000 acres? What's he want 1,000,000 acres for?" The man took his whitening, puckering hands out of the water and spread them, and he tightened his lower lip and bent his head down on one shoulder. "I don't know," he said. "Guess he's crazy. Must be crazy. Seen a picture of him. He looks crazy. Crazy and mean. Say he's scared to die." Casey asked. "That's what I heard. Scared God'll get him? I don't know. Just scared." "What's he care?" Pa said. "It don't seem like he's having no fun." "Grandpa was scared," Tom said. "When Grandpa is having the most fun, he comes closest to getting killed." Time Grandpa and another fella wanged a bunch of Navajo in the night. They was having the time of their life, and at the same time you wouldn't give a gopher for the chance. Casey said, "Seems like that's the way. Fella having fun, he don't give a damn. But a fella mean and lonely and old and disappointed, he's scared of dying." Pause. "What's he disappointed if he got 1,000,000 acres?" The preacher smiled, but he looked puzzled. He splashed a floating water bug away with his hand. "If he needs 1,000,000 acres to make him feel rich, it seems to me he needs it, 'cause he feels awful poor inside himself. And if he's poor inside himself, there ain't no 1,000,000 acres that's gonna make him feel rich. And maybe he's disappointed that nothing he can do will make him feel rich. Not rich like Mrs. Wilson was when she gave her tent when Grandpa died. I ain't trying to preach no sermon, but I ain't never seen nobody that's busy as a prairie dog collecting stuff that wasn't disappointed." He grinned. "Does kind of sound like a sermon, don't it?" The sun was flaming fiercely now. Pa said, "Better scrunch down under the water. She'll burn the living Jesus out of you." And he reclined and let the gently moving water flow around his neck. "If a fellow's willing to work hard, can't he cut her?" The man sat up and faced him. "Look, mister, I don't know everything. You might go out there and fall into a steady job, and I'd be a liar. And then you might never get no work, and I didn't warn you. I can tell you most folks are pretty miserable." He lay back in the water. "And a fellow don't know everything," he said. Pa turned his head and looked at Uncle John. "He was never a fellow to say much," Pa said, "but I'll be goddamned if you open your mouth twice since we left home." what you think about this here. Uncle John scowled. I don't think nothing about it. We're going there, ain't we? None of this here talk is gonna keep us from going there. When we get there, we'll get there. When we get a job, we'll work, and when we don't get a job, we'll sit on our own tail. And this here talk ain't gonna do no good, no way. Tom lay back and filled his mouth with water, and he spurted in the air, and he laughed. Uncle John don't talk much, but he talks sense. Yes, by God, he talks sense. We're going on tonight, Pa. Might as well get her over. Well, I'm going up in the brush and get some sleep then. Tom stood up and waded to the sandy shore. He slipped his clothes on his wet body and winced under the heat of the cloth. The others followed him. In the water, the man and the boy watched the Jodes disappear, and the boy said, "Like to see him in 6 months." Jesus. The man wiped his eye corners with his forefinger. "I shouldn't have did that," he said. "Fellow always wants to be a wise guy, wants to tell folks stuff." Jesus, Pa. They asked for that. Yeah, I know, but like that, a fella says they're going anyway. Nothing won't be changed from what I told them, except they'll be miserable before they have to. Tom walked in among the willows, and he crawled into a cave of shade to lie down, and Noah followed him. "Gonna sleep here," Tom said. "Tom." "Yeah?" "Tom, I ain't a-going." Tom sat up. "What do you mean?" "Tom, I ain't a-going leave this here water. I'm a-gonna walk down this here river." "You're crazy," Tom said. Get myself a piece of line. I'll catch fish. Fella can't starve beside a nice river." Tom said, "How about the family? How about Ma?" "I can't help it. I can't leave this here water." Noah's wide-set eyes were half closed. "You know how it is, Tom. You know how the folks are nice to me, but they don't really care for me. You're crazy." "No, I ain't. I know how I am. I know they're sorry. But, well, I ain't a-going. You tell Ma, Tom." "Now, you look a-here. No, it ain't no use. I was in that there water, and I ain't a-going to leave her. I'm a-gonna go now, Tom, down the river. I'll catch fish and stuff, but I can't leave her. I can't." He crawled back out of the willow cave. "You tell Ma, Tom." He walked away. Tom followed him to the riverbank. "Listen, you goddamn fool. It ain't no use," Noah said. "I'm sad, but I can't help it. I got to go." He turned abruptly and walked downstream towards the shore. Tom started to follow, and then he stopped. He saw Noah disappear into the brush, and then appear again, following the edge of the river. And he watched Noah growing smaller on the edge of the river, until he disappeared into the willows at last, and Tom took off his cap and scratched his head. He went back to his willow cave and lay down to sleep. Under the spread tarpaulin, Grandma lay on a mattress, and Ma sat beside her. The air was stiflingly hot, and the flies buzzed in the shade of the canvas. Grandma was naked under a long piece of pink curtain. She turned her old head restlessly from side to side, and she muttered and choked. Ma sat on the ground beside her, and with a piece of cardboard drove the flies away and fanned a stream of moving hot air over the tight old face. Rosa Sharon sat on the other side and watched her mother. Grandma called imperiously, Will, you come here, Will," and her eyes opened, and she looked fiercely about. "Told him to come right here," she said. "I'll catch him. I'll take the hair off of him." She closed her eyes and rolled her head back and forth and muttered thickly. Ma fanned with the old cardboard. Rosa Sharon had looked helplessly at the old woman. She said softly, "She's awful sick." Ma raised her eyes to the girl's face. Ma's eyes were patient, but the lines of strain were on her forehead. Ma fanned and fanned the air, and her piece of cardboard warned off the flies. "When you're young, Rosa Sharon, everything that happens is a thing all by itself. It's a lonely thing. I know. I remember," Rosa Sharon. Her mouth loved the name of her daughter. "You're gonna have a baby, Rosa Sharon, and that's something to you lonely in a way. That's gonna hurt you, and the hurt'll be a lonely hurt. And this here tent is alone in the world," Rosa Sharon. She whipped the air for a moment to drive a buzzing blow fly on, and the big shining fly circled the tent twice and zoomed out into the blinding sunlight. And Ma went on, "There's a time of change, and when that comes, dyin' is a piece all dyin', and bearing is a piece of all bearin', and bearin' and dyin' is two pieces of the same thing. And then things ain't so lonely no more. And then hurt don't hurt so bad, 'cause it ain't lonely hurt no more, Rose Sharon. I wished I could tell you so you know, but I can't. Her voice was so soft and so full of love that tears crowded into Rose Sharon's eyes and flowed over her eyes and blinded her. Take and fan Grandma, Ma said, and she handed the cardboard to her daughter. That's a good thing to do. I wished I could tell you so you'd know. Grandma, scowling her brows down over her closed eyes, bleated, Will, you're dirty. You ain't never gonna get clean. Her little wrinkled claws moved up and scratched her neck. A red ant ran up the curtain cloth and scrambled over the folds of loose skin on the old lady's neck. Ma reached quickly and picked it off, crushed it between her thumb and forefinger, and brushed her fingers on her dress. Rose Sharon waved the cardboard fan. She looked up at Ma. And the words parched in her throat. Wipe your feet. Will, you dirty pig, Grandma cried. Ma said, I don't know. Maybe if we can get her where it ain't so hot, but I don't know. Don't worry yourself, Rose Sharon. Take your breath in when you need it, and let go when you need to. A large woman in a torn black dress looked into the tent. Her eyes were bleared and indefinite, and the skin sagged on her jowls and hung down in little flaps. Her lips were loose, so that the upper lip hung like a curtain over her teeth, and her lower lip, by its weight, folded outward, showing her lower gums. Mornin', ma'am, she said. Mornin', and praise God for victory. Ma looked around. Mornin', she said. The woman stooped into the tent and bent her head over Grandma. We heard you got a soul here ready to join her Jesus. Praise God. Ma's face tightened and her eyes grew sharp. She's tired, that's all. She's wore out with the road and the heat. She's just wore out. Get a little rest and she'll be well. The woman leaned down over Grandma's face and she seemed almost to sniff. Then she turned to Ma and nodded quickly, and her lips jiggled and her jowls quivered. A dear soul gonna join her Jesus, she said. Ma cried, that ain't so. The woman nodded, slowly, this time, and put a puffy hand on Grandma's forehead. Ma reached to snatch the hand away and quickly restrained herself. Yes, it's so, sister, the woman said. We got 6 in holiness in our tent. I'll go get 'em, and we'll hold a meeting, a prayer, and grace, Jehovites and all. 6 counted me. I gotta get 'em out. Ma stiffened. No. She said, no, Grandma's tired. She couldn't stand a meeting. The woman said, couldn't stand a grace? Couldn't stand the sweet breath of Jesus? What you talking about, sister? Ma said, no, not here. She's too tired. The woman looked reproachfully at Ma. Ain't you believers, ma'am? We always been holiness, Ma said, but Grandma's tired, and we been a-goin' all night. We won't trouble you. It ain't no trouble, and if it was, we'd want to do it. For a soul a-soarin' to the Lamb. Ma rose to her knees. We thank you, she said coldly. We ain't gonna have no meeting in this here tent. The woman looked at her for a long time. Well, we ain't gonna let a sister go away without a little praisin'. We'll get the meeting going in our own tent, ma'am, and we'll forgive you for your hard heart. Ma settled back and turned her face to Grandma, and her face was still set and hard. She's tired, Ma said. She's only tired. Grandma swung her head back and forth and muttered in her breath. The woman walked stiffly out of the tent. Ma continued to look down at the old face. Rose Sharon fanned her cardboard and moved the hot air in a stream. She said, Ma, yeah, why don't you let 'em hold a meeting? I don't know, said Ma. Jehovites is a good people. They're howlers and jumpers. I don't know, something just come over me. I didn't think I could stand it. I'd just fly all apart. From some little distance there came the sound of the beginning of the meeting, a sing-song chant of exhortation. The words were not clear, only the tone. The voice rose and fell and went higher at each rise. Now a response filled in the pause, and the exhortation went up with a tone of triumph, and a growl of power came into the voice. It swelled and paused, and a growl came into the response. Now, gradually, the sentences of exhortation shortened, grew sharper, like commands, and into the responses came a complaining note. The rhythm quickened. Male and female voices had been one tone, but now, in the middle of a response, one woman's voice went up and up in a wailing cry, wild and fierce, like the cry of a beast, and a deeper woman's voice rose up beside it, a baying voice, and a man's voice traveled up the scale in a howl of a wolf. The exhortation stopped, and only the feral howling came from the tent, and with it a thudding sound on the earth. Ma shivered. Rose Sharon's breath was panting and short, and the chorus of howls went on so long that it seemed that the lungs must burst. Ma said, "Makes me nervous. Something happened to me." Now the high voice broke into hysteria. The gabbling screams of a hyena. The thudding became louder. Voices cracked and broke, and then the whole chorus fell into a sobbing, grunting undertone, and the slap of flesh and the thudding on the earth, and the sobbing changed to a little whining, like that of a little litter of puppies at a food dish. Rose Sharon cried softly with nervousness. Grandma kicked the curtain off her legs, which lay like gray knotted sticks, and Grandma whined with the whining in the distance. Ma pulled the curtain back in place, and then Grandma sighed deeply, and her breathing grew steady and easy, and her closed eyelids ceased their flickering. She slept deeply and snored through her half-open mouth. The whining from the distance was softer and softer until it could not be heard at all anymore. Rosa Sharon looked at Ma, and her eyes were blank with tears. "It done good," said Rosa Sharon. "It done Grandma good. She's a-sleepin'." Ma's head was down, and she was ashamed. "Maybe I done them good people wrong. Grandma is asleep." "Why you asked our preacher if you done a sin?" the girl asked. "I will, but he's a queer man. Maybe it's him made me tell them people they couldn't come here. That preacher, he's getting round to thinking that what people does is right to do." Ma looked at her hands, and then she said, "Rose Sharon, we gotta sleep. If we're gonna go tonight, we gotta sleep." She stretched out on the ground beside the mattress. Rose Sharon asked, "How about Fan and Grandma?" "She's asleep for now. You lay down and rest." "I wonder where Connie is," the girl complained. "I ain't seen him around for a long time." Ma said, "Shh, get some rest." "Ma, Connie gonna study nights and get to be something." "Yeah, you told me about that. Get some rest." The girl lay down on the edge of Grandma's mattress. "Connie's got a new plan. He's thinking all the time. When he gets all up on electricity, he's gonna have his own store. And then guess what we gonna have?" "What?" "Ice. All the ice you want. Gonna have an ice box. Keep it full. Stuff don't spoil if you got ice." "Connie's thinking all the time," Ma chuckled. "Better get some rest now." Rosa Sharon closed her eyes. Ma turned over on her back and crossed her hands under her head. She listened to Grandma's breathing and to the girl's breathing. She moved a hand to start a fly from her forehead. The camp was quiet in the blinding heat, but the noises of hot grass, of crickets, and the hum of flies were a tone that was close to silence. Ma sighed deeply, and then yawned and closed her eyes. In her half-sleep, she heard footsteps approaching, but it was a man's voice that started her awake. "Who's in here?" Ma sat up quickly. A brown-faced man bent over and looked in. He wore boots and khaki pants and a khaki shirt with epaulets. On a Sam Brown belt, a pistol holster hung, and a big silver star was pinned to his shirt at the left breast. A loose-crowned military cap was on the back of his head. He beat on the tarpaulin with his hand, and the tight canvas vibrated like a drum. "Who's in here?" he demanded. Ma asked, "What is it you want, mister?" "What do you think I want? I just want to know who's in here." "Why, there's just 3 of us in here. Me and Grandma and my girl." "Where's your men?" "Why, they went down to clean up. We was driving all night." "Where'd you come from?" "Right near Sallisaw, Oklahoma." "Well, you can't stay here. We aim to get out tonight and cross the desert, mister." "Well, you better. If you're here tomorrow this time, I'll run you in. We don't want none of you settling down here." Ma's face blackened with anger. She got slowly to her feet. She stooped to the utensil box and picked out an iron skillet. "Mister," she said, "you got a tin button and a gun. Where I come from, you keep your voice down." She advanced on him with the skillet. He loosened the gun in the holster. "Go ahead, Ma, scarin' woman. I'm thankful the men folks ain't here. They'd tear you to pieces. In my country, you watch your tongue." "Well, you ain't in your country now. You're in California, and we don't want you goddamn Okies settling down." Ma's advance stopped. She looked puzzled. "Oakleys?" she said softly. "Okies. Yeah, Okies, and if you're here when I come tomorrow, I'll run you in." He turned and walked to the next tent and banged on the canvas with his hand. "Who's in here?" he said. Ma went slowly back under the tarpaulin. She put the skillet in the utensil box. She sat down slowly. Rose Sharon watched her secretly, and when she saw Ma fighting with her face, Rose Sharon closed her eyes and pretended to be asleep. The sun sank low in the afternoon, but the heat did not seem to decrease. Tom awakened under his willow, and his mouth was parched, and his body was wet with sweat, and his head was dissatisfied with his rest. He staggered to his feet and walked towards the water. He peeled his clothes off and waded into the stream. And the moment the water was about him, his thirst was gone. He lay back in the shallows, and his body floated. He held himself in place with his elbows in the sand and looked at his toes, which bobbed above the surface. A pale, skinny little boy crept like an animal through the reeds and slipped off his clothes, and he squirmed into the water like a muskrat and pulled himself alongside like a muskrat, only his eyes and nose above the surface. Then he suddenly saw Tom's head and saw that Tom was watching him. He stopped his game and sat up. Tom said, "Hello." "Lo. Looks like you was playing muskrat." "Well, I was." He edged gradually away towards the bank. He moved casually, and then he leaped out, gathered his clothes with a sweep of his arms, and was gone among the willows. Tom laughed quietly, and then he heard his name called slightly. "Tom! Oh, Tom!" He sat up in the water and whistled through his teeth, a piercing whistle with a loop on the end. The willow shook, and Ruthie stood looking at him. "Ma wants you," she said. "Ma wants you right away." All right. He stood up and strode through the water to the shore, and Ruthie looked with interest and amazement at his naked body. Tom, seeing the direction of her eyes, said, "Run on now, get," and Ruthie ran. Tom heard her calling excitedly for Winfield as she went. He put the hot clothes on his cool, wet body, and he walked slowly up toward through the willows toward the tent. Ma had started a fire of dry willow twigs, and she had a pan of water heating. She looked relieved when she saw him. "What's the matter, Ma?" he asked. "I was scared," she said. "There was a policeman here. He says we can't stay here. I was scared he'd talk to you. I was scared you'd hit him if he talked to you." Tom said, "What'd I go and hit a policeman for?" Ma smiled. "Well, he talked so bad, I nearly hit him myself." Tom grabbed her arm and shook her roughly and loosely, and then he laughed. He sat down on the ground, still laughing. "My God, Ma, I knowed you I know you when you was gentle. What's come over you?" She looked serious. "I don't know, Tom. First you stand us off with a jack-handle, now you try to hit a cop." He laughed softly, and he reached out and patted her bare foot tenderly. "An old hellcat," he said. "Tom?" "Yeah?" She hesitated a long time. "Tom, this here policeman, he called us Okies. He said, we don't want you goddamn Okies settling down." Tom studied her, and his hand still rested gently on her bare foot. "Fella told about that," he said. "Fella told how they say it." He considered. "Ma, would you say I was a bad fella? Ought to be locked up like that?" "No," she said. "You been tried." "No." "Why you asking me that for?" "Well, I don't know. I'd have took a sock at that cop." Ma smiled with amusement. "Maybe I oughta ask you that, 'cause I nearly hit him with a skillet." "Ma, why'd he say we couldn't stop here?" "Just says they don't want no damn Okies settling down. Says he gotta run us in if we're here tomorrow. But we ain't used to getting shoved around by no cops." "I told him that," said Ma. "He says we ain't home now. We're in California, and they do what they want." Tom said uneasily, "Ma, I got something to tell you. Noah, he went on down the river. He ain't a-going on." It took a moment for Ma to understand. Why? She asked softly. I don't know. Says he got to. Says he got to stay. Says for me to tell you. How'll he eat? She demanded. I don't know. Says he'll catch fish. Ma was silent a long time. Family's falling apart, she said. I don't know. Seems like I can't think no more. I just can't think. There's too much. Tom said lamely, He'll be all right, Ma. He's a funny kind of fella. Ma turned stunned eyes toward the river. I just can't seem to think no more. Tom looked down the line of tents, and he saw Ruthie and Winfield standing in front of a tent in decorous conversation with somebody inside. Ruthie was twisting her skirt in her hand while Winfield dug a hole in the ground with his toe. Tom called, You, Ruthie! She looked up and saw him and trotted toward him, with Winfield behind her. When she came up, Tom said, You go get our folks. They're sleeping down the willows. Get 'em. And you, Winfield, you tell the Wilsons we're gonna get rolling soon as we can. The children spun around and charged off. Tom said, Ma, how's Grandma now? Well, she got to sleep today. Maybe she's better. She's still asleepin'. That's good. How much pork we got? Not very much. Quarter hog. Well, we gotta fill that other keg with water. Got to take water along. They could hear Ruthie's shrill cries for the men down in the willows. Ma shoved willow sticks in the fire and made it crackle up about the black pot. She said, I pray God we gonna get some rest. I pray Jesus we gonna lay down in a nice place. The sun sank toward the baked and broken hills to the west. The pot over the fire bubbled furiously. Ma went under the tarpaulin and came out with an apron full of potatoes, and she dropped them into the boiling water. I pray to God we gonna be let to wash some clothes. We ain't never been dirty like this. Don't even wash potatoes 'fore we boil 'em. I wonder why. Seems like the heart's took out of us. The men came trooping up from the willows, and their eyes were full of sleep, and their faces were red and puffed with daytime sleep. Pa said, What's the matter? We're going, said Tom. Cop says we gotta go. Might's well get her over. Get a good head start, and maybe we'll be through her. Near 300 miles where we're going. Pa said, I thought we was gonna get a rest. Well, we ain't. We gotta go, Pa, Tom said. Noah ain't a-goin'. He walked on down the river. Ain't going? What the hell's the matter with him? And then Pa caught himself. My fault, he said miserably. That boy is all my fault. No, I don't want to talk about it no more, said Pa. I can't. My fault. Well, we got to go, said Tom. Wilson walked near for the last words. We can't go, folks, he said. Sary's done up. She's got to rest. She ain't gonna get across that desert alive. They were silent at his words, and then Tom said, Cop says he'll run us in if we're here tomorrow. Wilson shook his head. His eyes were glazed with worry, and a paleness showed through his dark skin. Just have to do her, then. Sary can't go. If they jail us, why, they'll have to jail us. She's got to rest and get strong. Pa said, maybe we better wait and all go together. No, Wilson said. You've been nice to us. You've been kind, but you can't stay here. You got to get on and get jobs and work. We ain't gonna let you stay. Pa said excitedly, but you ain't got nothing. Wilson smiled. Never had nothing when you took us up. This ain't none of your business. Don't make me get mean. You got to go, or I'll get mean and mad. Ma beckoned Pa into the cover of the tarpaulin and spoke softly to him. Wilson turned to Casey. Sary wanted you to go see her. Sure, said the preacher. He walked to the Wilson tent, tiny and gray, and he slipped the flaps aside and entered. It was dusky and hot inside. The mattress lay on the ground, and the equipment was scattered about as it had been unloaded in the morning. Sary lay on the mattress, her eyes wide and bright. He stood and looked down at her, his large head bent and the stringy muscles of his neck tight along the sides, and he took off his hat and held it in his hand. She said, Did my man tell you we couldn't go on? That's what he said. Her low, beautiful voice went on. I wanted us to go. I knowed I wouldn't live to the other side, but he'd be across anyway. But he won't go. He don't know. He thinks it's going to be all right. He don't know. He says he won't go. I know, she said, and he's stubborn. I asked you to come and say a prayer. I ain't a preacher, he said softly. My prayers ain't no good. She moistened her lips. I was there when the old man died. You said one of them. It wasn't no prayer. It was a prayer, she said. It wasn't no preacher's prayer. It was a good prayer. I want you should say one for me. I don't know what to say. She closed her eyes for a minute and then opened them again. Then say one to yourself. Don't use no words to it. That'd be all right. I got no God, he said. You got a God. Don't make no difference if you don't know what he looks like. The preacher bowed his head. She watched him apprehensively, and when he raised his head again, she looked relieved. That's good, she said. That's what I needed, somebody close enough to pray. He shook his head as though to awaken himself. I don't understand this here, he said, and she replied, Yes, you know, don't you? I know, he said. I know, but I don't understand. Maybe you'll just rest for a few days and then come on. She shook her head slowly from side to side. I'm just a pain covered with skin. I know what it is, but I won't tell him. He'd be too sad. He wouldn't know what to do anyways. Maybe in the night when he's asleep and when he waked up, it won't be so bad. You want I should stay with you and not go on? No, she said. No. When I was a little girl, I used to sing. Folks round about used to say I sung as nice as Jenny Lind. Folks used to come and listen when I sung. And when they stood and me a singing, why, me and them was together more than you could ever know. I was thankful. There ain't so many folks can feel so full up, so close. And them folks standing there and me a singing. Thought maybe I'd sing in theaters, but I never done it, and I'm glad. They wasn't nothing got in between me and them. And that's why I wanted you to pray. I wanted to feel that closeness once more. It's the same thing, singing and praying. Just the same thing. I wish you could have heard me sing. He looked down at her, into her eyes. Goodbye, he said. She shook her head slowly back and forth and closed her lips tight. And the preacher went out of the dusky tent into the blinding light. The men were loading up the truck, Uncle John on top, while the others passed equipment up to him. He stowed it carefully, keeping the surface level. Ma emptied the quarter of a keg of salt pork into a pan, and Tom and Al took both little barrels to the river and washed them. They tied them to the running boards and carried water in the buckets to fill them. Then, over the top, they tied canvas to keep them from slopping the water out. Only the tarpaulin and Grandma's mattress were left put on. Tom said, with the load we'll take, this old wagon will boil her head off. We gotta have plenty of water. Ma passed the boiled potatoes out and brought half a sack in it from the tent and put it with the pan of pork. The family ate standing, shuffling their feet and tossing the hot potatoes from hand to hand until they cooled. Ma went to the Wilson tent and stayed for 10 minutes, and then she came out quietly. It's time to go, she said. The men went under the tarpaulin. Grandpa still slept, her mouth wide open. They lifted a whole mattress gently and passed it up on top of the truck. Grandma drew her skinny legs and frowned in her sleep, but she did not awaken. Uncle John and Pa tied the tarpaulin over the crosspiece, making a little tight tent on top of the load. They lashed it down into side bars, and then they were ready. Pa took out his purse and dug 2 crushed bills from it. He went to Wilson and held them out. We want you should take this. And he pointed to the pork and potatoes and that. Wilson hung his head and shook it sharply. I ain't gonna do it, and he said. You ain't got much. Got enough to get there, said Pa. We ain't left it at all. We'll have to work right off. I ain't gonna do it, Wilson said. I'll get mean if you try. Ma took the 2 bills from Pa's hand. She folded them neatly and put them on the ground and placed the pork pan over them. That's where they'll be, she said. If you don't get them, somebody else will. Wilson, his head still down, turned and went to the tent, and he stepped inside, and the flaps fell behind them. For a few moments the family waited, and then, we gotta go, said Tom. It's near 4, I bet. The family climbed on the truck. Ma on top beside Grandma, Tom and Al and Pa in the seat, and Winfield on Pa's lap. Connie and Rose Sharon made a nest against the cab. The preacher and Uncle John and Ruthie were entangled on the load. Pa called, Goodbye, Mr. and Miss Wilson. There was no answer from the tent. Tom started the engine, and the truck lumbered away. and as they crawled up the rough road toward the Needles and the highway, Ma looked back. Wilson stood in front of his tent, staring after them, and his hat was in his hand. The sun fell full on his face. Ma waved her hand at him, but he did not respond. Tom kept the truck in second gear over the rough road to protect the springs. At Needles, he drove into a service station, checked the worn tires for air, checked the spares tied to the back. He had the gas tank filled, and he bought 2 5-gallon cans of gasoline and a 2-gallon can of oil. He filled the radiator, begged a map, and studied it. The service station boy in his white uniform seemed uneasy until the bill was paid. He said, "You people sure have got nerve." Tom looked up from the map. "What do you mean?" "Well, crossing in a jalopy like this." "You been across?" "Sure, plenty, but not in no wreck like this." Tom said, "If we broke down, maybe somebody would give us a hand." "Well, maybe, but folks are kind of scared to stop at night. I'd hate to be doing that. Takes more nerve than I've got." Tom grinned. "Well, it don't take no nerve to do something when there ain't nothing else you can do." "Well, thanks. We'll drag on." And he got in the truck and moved away. The boy in white went into the iron building where his helper labored over a book of bills. "Jesus, what a hard-looking outfit. Them Okies, they're all hard-looking." "Jesus, I'd hate to start out in a jalopy like this." "Well, you and me got sense. Them goddamn Okies got no sense and no feeling. They ain't human. A human being wouldn't live like they do. A human being couldn't stand it to be so dirty and miserable. They ain't a hell of a lot better than gorillas. Just the same, I'm glad I ain't crossing the desert in no Hudson Super 6. She sounds like a threshing machine." The other boy looked down at the book of bills, and a big drop of sweat rolled down his finger and fell on the pink bills. "You know, they don't have much trouble. They're so goddamn dumb. They don't know if it's dangerous. And Christ almighty, they don't know any better than what they got. Why worry? I'm not worrying. Just thought if it was me I wouldn't like it." "That's 'cause you know better. They don't know any better." And he wiped the sweat from the pink bill with his sleeve. The trucks took the road and moved up the long hill, through the broken, rotten rock. The engine boiled very soon, and Tom slowed down and took it easy. Up the long slope, winding and twisting through dead country, burned white and gray, and no hint of life in it. Once Tom stopped for a few moments to let the engine cool, and then he traveled on. They topped the pass while the sun was still up, and looked down on the desert, black cinder mountains in the distance, and the yellow sun reflected on the gray desert. The little starved bushes, sage and greasewood, threw bold shadows on the sand and bits of rock. The glaring sun was straight ahead. Tom held his hand before his eyes to see it all. They passed the crest and coasted down to cool the engine. They coasted down the long sweep to the floor of the desert, and the fan turned over to cool the water in the radiator. In the driver's seat, Tom and Al and Pa, and Winfield on Pa's knee, looked into the bright descending sun, and their eyes were stony, and their brown faces were damp with perspiration. The burnt land and the black, cindery hills broke the even distance, and made it terrible in the reddening light of the setting sun. Al said, "Jesus, what a place! How'd you like to walk across her?" "People done it," said Tom. "Lots of people done it. And if they could, they would. We could." "Lots must have died," said Al. "Well, we ain't come out here exactly clean." Al was silent for a while, and then the reddening desert swept past. "Think we'll ever see them Wilsons again?" Tom flicked his eyes down to the oil gauge. "I got a hunch nobody ain't gonna see Miss Wilson for a long. Just a hunch I got." Winfield said, "Pa, I want to get out." Tom looked over him. "Might as well let everybody out before we settle down driving tonight." He slowed the car and brought it to a stop. Winfield scrambled out and urinated on the side of the road. Tom leaned out. Anybody else? We're holding our water up here," Uncle John called. Pa said, "Winfield, you crawl up on top. You put my legs into sleep it, a setting on 'em." The little boy buttoned his overalls and obediently crawled up the backboard, and on his hands and knees crawled over Grandma's mattress forward to Ruthie. The truck moved on into the evening, and the edge of the sun struck the rough horizon and turned the desert red. Ruthie said, "Wouldn't leave you set up there, huh?" "I didn't want to. It wasn't so nice as here. Couldn't lie down." "Well, don't you bother squawking and talking," Ruthie said, "'cause I'm going to sleep. And when I wake up, we're going to be there, 'cause Tom said so. Gonna seem funny to see pretty country." The sun went down and left a great halo in the sky, and it grew very dark under the tarpaulin. A long cave with light at each end, and a flat triangle of light. Connie and Rose Sharon leaned back against the cab, and the hot wind tumbling through the tent struck the backs of their heads, and the tarpaulin whipped and drummed above them. They spoke together in low tones, pitched to the drumming canvas, so nobody could hear them. When Connie spoke, he turned his head and spoke into her ear, and she did the same to him. She said, "Seems like we wasn't never gonna do nothing but move. I'm so tired." He turned his head to her ear. "Maybe in the morning. How'd you like to be alone now, in the dust?" His hand moved out and stroked her hip. She said, "Don't. You'll make me crazy as a loon. Don't do that." And she turned her head to hear his response. "Maybe, when everybody's asleep. Maybe," she said. "But wait till they get asleep. You'll make me crazy, and maybe they won't get no sleep." "I can't hardly stop," he said. "I know. Me neither. Let's talk about when we get there, and you'll move away before I get crazy." He shifted away a little. "Well, I'll get to studying nights right off," he said. She sighed deeply. "Gonna get one of them books that tells about it and cuts the coupon right off." "How long, you think?" "How long what?" "How long before you be making big money and we got ice?" "Can't tell," he said importantly. "Can't really tell. Fellow ought to be studied up pretty good for Christmas. Soon as you'll get studied up and we can get ice and stuff, I guess." He chuckled. "It's this here heat," he said. "What you gonna need ice around Christmas for?" She go, "That's right, but I'd like ice anytime." "Now don't. You'll get me crazy." The dusk passed into dark, and the desert stars came out in the soft sky, stars stabbing and sharp, with few points and rays to them, and the sky was velvet. And the heat changed. While the sun was up, it was beating, flailing heat, but now the heat came from below, from the earth itself, and the heat was thick and muffling. The lights of the truck came on, and they illuminated a little blur of the highway ahead, and a strip of the desert on either side of the road. And sometimes eyes gleamed in the lights far ahead, but no animal showed in the lights. It was pitch dark under the canvas now. Uncle John and the preacher were curled in the middle of the truck, resting on their elbows and staring out the back triangle. They could see two bumps that were Ma and Grandpa against the outside. They could see Ma move occasionally, and her dark arm moving out against the outside. Uncle John talked to the preacher. "Casey," he said, "you're a fella ought to know what to do." "What to do about what?" "I don't know," said John. Casey said, "Well, that's going to make it easy for me." "Well, you've been a preacher. Look, John, everybody takes a crack at me 'cause I've been a preacher. A preacher ain't nothing but a man." "Yeah, but he's a kind of man, else he wouldn't be a preacher. I want to ask you, well, you think a fella could bring bad luck to folks?" "I don't know," said Casey. "I don't know." "Well, see, I was married, fine, good girl, and one night she got pain in her stomach, and she says, 'You better get a doctor.' And I says, 'Hell, you just ate too much.'" Uncle John put his hand on Casey's knee, and he peered through the darkness at him. "She gave me a look, and she groaned all night, and she died the next afternoon." The preacher mumbled something. "You see," John went on, "I killed her, and since then I tried to make it up, mostly to kids, and I tried to be good, and I can't. I get drunk, and I go wild." "Everybody goes wild," said Casey. "I do too." "Yeah, but you ain't got a sin on your soul like me." Casey said gently, "Sure I got sins. Everybody got sins. A sin is something you ain't sure about. Them people that's sure about everything and ain't got no sin, well, with that kind of son of a bitch, if I was God, I'd kick their ass right out of heaven. I couldn't stand 'em." Uncle John said, I got a feeling I'm bringing bad luck to my own folks. I got a feeling I ought to get away and let 'em be. I ain't comfortable being like this. I know this. Casey said, I know this. A man gotta do what he gotta do. I can't tell you. I can't tell you. I don't think there's luck or bad luck. Only one thing in this world, I'm sure of, and that's I'm sure nobody got a right to mess with a fellow's life. He got to do it all himself. Help him maybe, but not tell him what to do. Uncle John said disappointedly, Then you don't know. I don't know. You think it was a sin to let my wife die like that? Well, said Casey, for anybody else it was a mistake, but if you think it was a sin, then it's a sin. A fellow builds his own sins right up from the ground. I gotta give that going over, said John, and he rolled on his back and laid with his knees pulled up. The truck moved on over the hot earth, and the hours passed. Ruthie and Winfield went to sleep. Connie loosened a blanket from the load and covered himself and Rose shared with it, and in the heat they struggled together and held their breaths. And after a time, Connie threw off the blanket, and the hot, tunneling wind felt cool on their wet bodies. On the back of the truck, Ma lay on the mattress beside Grandma, and she could not see with her eyes, but she could feel the struggling body and the struggling heart, and the sobbing breath was in her ear. And then Ma said over and over, All right, it's gonna be all night. And she said hoarsely, You know the family got to get across. You know that. John called, You all right? It was a moment before she answered. All right. I guess I dropped off to sleep. And after a time, Grandma was still, and Ma lay rigid beside her. The night hours passed, and the dark was in against the truck. Sometimes cars passed them, going west and away, and sometimes great trucks came up out of the west and rumbled eastward, and the stars flowed down in a slow cascade over the western horizon. It was near midnight when they neared Daggett, where the inspection station is. The road was floodlighted there, and a sign illuminated, Keep right and stop. The officers loafed in their office, but they came out and stood under the long covered shed when Tom pulled up. One officer put down the license number and raised the hood. Tom asked, What's this here? Agricultural inspection. We gotta look over your stuff. Got any vegetables or seeds? No, said Tom. Well, we gotta look over your stuff. You got to unload. Now Ma climbed heavily down from the truck. Her face was swollen and her eyes were hard. Look, mister, we got a sick old lady. We got to get her to a doctor. We can't wait. She seemed to fight with hysteria. You can't make us wait. Yeah? Well, we gotta look you over. I swear we ain't got anything, Ma cried. I swear it, and Grandma's awful sick. You don't look so good yourself, the officer said. Ma pulled herself up the back of the truck, hoisted herself with huge strength. Look, she said. The officer shot a flashlight beam up on the old shrunken face. By God, she is, he said. You swear you got no seeds or fruits or vegetables, no corn or oranges? No, I swear. Then go ahead. You can get a doctor in Barstow. That's only 8 miles. Go on ahead. Tom climbed in and drove on. The officer turned to his companion. I couldn't hold him. Maybe it was a bluff. Oh, Jesus, no. You should have seen that old woman's face. That wasn't no bluff. Tom increased his speed to Barstow, and in the little town he stopped, got out, and walked around the truck. Ma leaned out. It's all right, she said. I didn't want to stop there. Fear we couldn't get across. Yeah, but how's Grandma? She's all right. All right, drive on. We got to get across. Tom shook his head and walked back. Al, he said, I'm gonna fill her up, and then you drive some. He pulled to an all-night gas station and filled the tank and the radiator and filled the crank case. Then Al slipped under the wheel and Tom took the outside, with Pa in the middle. They drove away in the darkness, and little hills near Barstow were behind them. Tom said, I don't know what's got into Ma. She's flighty as a dog with a flea in his ear. When it took long to look over the stuff, and she says Grandma's sick, and now she says Grandma's all right. I can't figure her out. She ain't right. Suppose she wore her brains out on the trip. Pa said, Ma's almost like she was when she was a girl. She's a wild one then. She wasn't scared of nothing. I thought having all the kids and working took it out of her, but I guess it ain't. Christ. When she got that jack handle back there, I tell you, I wouldn't want to have been that fella took it away from her. I don't know what's got into her, Tom said. Maybe she's tired out. Al said, I won't be doing no weeping and a moaning to get through. I got this goddamn car in my soul. Tom said, well, you done a damn good job of picking. We ain't had hardly no trouble with her at all. All night they bored through the hot darkness, and jackrabbits scuttled in the lights and dashed away in the long jolting leaps. And the dawn came up behind them when the lights of Mojave were ahead, and the dawn showed high mountains to the west. They filled with water and oil at Mojave, and crawled into the mountains, and the dawn was about them. Tom said, Jesus, the desert's past. Pa, Al, for Christ's sake, the desert's past. I'm too goddamn tired to care, said Al. Want me to drive? No, wait a while. They drove through to Tehachapi in the morning glow, and the sun came up behind them, and then suddenly they saw the great valley below them. Al jammed on the brakes and stopped in the middle of the road, and said, Jesus Christ, look, he said. The vineyards, the orchards, the great flat valley, green and beautiful, the trees set in rows, and farmhouses. And Pa said, God Almighty. The distant cities, the little towns in the orchard land, and the morning sun golden on the valley. A car honked behind them. Al pulled to the side of the road and parked. I want to look at her. The grain fields golden in the morning, and the willow lines, the eucalyptus trees in front, in rows. Pa sighed. I never knowed there was anything like her. The peach trees and the walnut groves and the dark green patches of oranges. The red roofs among the trees and barns, rich barns. Al got out and stretched his legs. He called, Ma, come look, we're there. Ruthie and Winfield scrambled down from the car, and then they stood silent and awestruck, embarrassed before the great valley. The distance was thinned with haze, and the land grew softer and softer in the distance. A windmill flashed in the sun, and its turning blades were like a little heliograph far away. Ruthie and Winfield looked at it, and Ruthie whispered, It's California. Winfield moved his lips silently over the syllables. There's fruit, he said aloud. Casey and Uncle John, Connie and Rosa Sharon climbed down, and they stood silently. Rosa Sharon had started to brush her hair back, and when she caught sight of the valley, and her hand dropped slowly to her side. Tom said, Where's Ma? I want Ma to see it. Look, Ma. Come here, Ma. Ma was climbing slowly, stiffly, down the backboard. Tom looked at her. My God, Ma, you sick? Her face was stiff and putty-like, and her eyes seemed to have sunk deeply into her head, and the rims were red with weariness. Her feet touched the ground, and she was braced herself by holding the truck's side. Her voice was a croak. You say we're across? Look. She turned her head, and her mouth opened a little. Her fingers went to her throat, and she gathered a pinch of skin and twisted gently. Thank God, she said. The family's here. Her knees buckled, and she sat down on the running board. You sick, Ma? No, just tired. Didn't you get no sleep? No. Was Grandma bad? Ma looked down at her hands lying together like two tired lovers on her lap. I wished I could wait and not tell you. I wish it could all be nice. Then Pa said, Then Grandma's bad. Ma raised her eyes and looked over the valley. Grandma's dead. They all looked at her, all of them, and Pa asked when. Before they stopped us last night. So that's why you didn't want 'em to look. I was afraid we wouldn't get across, she said. I told Grandma we couldn't help her, and the family had to get across. I told her when she was dying. We couldn't stop in the desert. There was the young ones and Rosa Sharon's baby. I told her. She put up her hands and covered her face for a moment. She can get buried in a nice green place, Ma said softly. Trees all around and a nice place. She got to lay her head down in California. The family looked at Ma with a little terror at her strength. Tom said, Jesus Christ, you laying there with her all night long? The family had to get across, Ma said miserably. Tom moved close and put his hand on her shoulder. Don't touch me, she said. I'll hold up if you don't touch me. That'd get me. Pa said, we gotta go on now. We gotta go on down. Ma looked up at him. Can I sit up front? I don't want to go back there no more. I'm tired. I'm awful tired. They climbed back on the load, and they avoided the long, stiff figure, covered and tucked in a comforter, even the head covered and tucked. They moved to their places and tried to keep their eyes from the hump on the comforter that would be the nose, and the steep cliff that would be the jut of the chin. They tried to keep their eyes away, and they could not. Ruthie and Winfield crowded in a forward corner as far away from the body as they could get, stared at the tucked figure. And Ruthie whispered, "That's Grandma, and she's dead." Winfield nodded solemnly. "She ain't breathing at all. She's awful dead." And Rose Sharon said softly to Connie, "She was a-dying right when we—" "How do we know?" he reassured her. Al climbed on the load to make room for Ma in the seat, and Al swaggered a little because he was sorry. He plumped down beside Casey and Uncle John. "Well, she was old. Guess her time was up," Al said. "Everybody got to die." Casey and Uncle John turned eyes expressionlessly on him and looked at him as though he were a curious talking bush. "Well, ain't they?" he demanded, and the eyes looked away, leaving Al sullen and shaken. Casey said in wonder, "All night long, and she was alone," he said. "John, there's a woman so great with love. She scares me, makes me afraid and mean." John asked, "Was it a sin? Is they any part of it you might call a sin?" "A sin? No. There ain't no part of it that's a sin. I ain't never done nothing that wasn't part sin," said John, and he looked at the long wrapped body. Tom and Ma and Pa got into the front seat. Tom let the truck roll and started on compression, and the heavy truck moved, snorting and jerking and popping down the hill. The sun was behind them, and the valley golden and green before them. Ma shook her head slowly from side to side. "It's purty," she said. "I wish they could have saw it." "I wish so, too," said Pa. Tom patted the steering wheel under his hand. "They was too old," he said. "They wouldn't have saw nothing that's here. Grandpa would have been a-seeing the Injuns and the prairie country when he was a young fella, and Grandma would have remembered and seen the first home she lived in. They was too old. Who's really seen it is Ruthie and Winfield." Pa said, "Here's Tommy talking like a grown man, talking like a preacher almost," and Ma smiled sadly. "He is. Tommy growed way up, so that I can't get a hold of him sometimes." They popped down the mountains, twisting and looping, losing the valley sometimes, then finding it again, and the hot breath of the valley came up to them, with hot green smells on it, and the resinous sage and tarweed smells. The crickets crackled along the road. A rattlesnake crawled across the road, and Tom hit it and broke it, and left it squirming. Tom said, "I guess we got to go to the coroner, wherever he is. We got to get her buried decent." "How much money might it be left, Pa?" "About $40, said Pa. Tom laughed. "Jesus, are we going to start clean? We sure ain't bringing nothing with us." He chuckled a moment, and then his face straightened quickly. He pulled the visor of his cap down low over his eyes, and the truck rolled down the mountain into the great valley.